Hi, good afternoon, everybody. This is Mike Siebold from FlowerHire. FlowerHire, building a conscious cannabis community one hire at a time. Today, I am being joined by my friend and my compatriot, Hirsh Jain from Ananda Strategy. Hirsh, thank you for joining the Geek Out.
Of course. So great to be here with you, Mike.
Okay, so a layup would be talking about rescheduling. Everyone is talking about the misinterpretation and the future prospects of our space by virtue of that, but we're not going to do that today. I am more curious about our original conversation as it pertains to I mean, primarily the political ramifications of Ohio and Florida. So, you talked thematically about legalization in major red states like Ohio and Florida. Your 2 cents, especially since last time we spoke, Ohio officially had not actually gone adult use.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so great to be having, this conversation. The last time we spoke was I think a month before Ohio voted on its adult use measure. So yeah, I mean, as you said, I think legalization in these really big red states like Ohio and Florida, what they kind of portend is a beginning of a red wave that will sweep the country over the next 2 to 3 years. And I think that's incredibly exciting. And I think, the quick summary here is that first, Ohio and Florida occupy a really unique place in the American political consciousness, right? These are two really big red states. Ohio is known as the quintessential Republican state. No Republican has ever won the White House without winning Ohio. And Florida, for anyone that's been paying attention to politics, particularly in the last few years, has sort of been the epicenter of conservative politics. So Ohio and Florida are quintessential red states. And they occupy that really important place in the American political consciousness. And I think also, in addition to that, they're just situated in two regions of the country that are deeply conservative, right? So Florida obviously is situated in the deep South and is the one state that basically borders or is close to many of those deep Southern states. Similarly, Ohio is sort of the bridge between the Midwest and Appalachia, right? It borders states like West Virginia, like Kentucky, like Indiana, that are really conservative. So in short, first, they occupy a unique place in the American political consciousness. Secondly, they're embedded in what we probably think of as the most conservative regions in the country. And third, and perhaps the most obvious thing, these are huge population centers. So these are all the reasons why these are important states. And I think maybe the larger context for this conversation is that prior to Ohio and Florida, and I'm sure we'll get into the details in a second, prior to them sort of moving in 2023 and hopefully in 2024, most of the states that have come online in cannabis have overwhelmingly been blue states. In the first decade of the cannabis legalization movement, right? If we consider that the first legal sale of adult use cannabis was basically 10 years ago, right? On January 1st, 2014. For much of the first decade of this movement, this was concentrated in blue states. And so now this is the opportunity for red states to come online. So I'll just conclude by saying, as I'm sure we'll get into, there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic that Ohio and Florida will start adult use sales quite soon and will be very successful states. And for the reasons that I mentioned, I think this will have sort of national reverberations around the country.
It's an interesting follow-up question to that. You know, Politics in America between, conservative and liberal, Democratic and Republican, business attitudes by virtue of that also change, not just public policy. The ramifications of the way businesses are regulated or not, the way that they're perpetuated. The interesting thing is we've seen, like to your point, mostly liberal, blue, coastal enclave marketplaces that in some instances have made their markets overwrought. New York is a perfect example of too much bureaucracy and not a lot of execution, a lot of political infighting, and not a lot of progress in creating a marketplace. When there have been instances of Republican enclaves, the few, entering the cannabis fray, like in Missouri as an example, we've seen a much more laissez-faire attitude. We've actually seen markets that grow precipitously and dramatically. Is that by virtue of the nature within political leanings of having more of a free market and by virtue of that less oversight? Or do you think it's just circumstantial to the place itself? Missouri, as a state with business and infrastructure, was able to facilitate a better regulated industry.
Yeah, Mike, I mean, I think you're hitting on a really interesting duality here. I think what you're highlighting is a pretty interesting phenomenon, right? And so, as you mentioned, and as I was kind of alluding to earlier, many of the states that initially legalized cannabis were primarily blue states. And as we all know, blue states in general tend to have a higher regulatory appetite than red states. They tend to believe that the state has more of a role in regulating the economy. They're less free market oriented than red states. And so I think, the sort of duality that you hit on is interesting because many of these blue states were initially the ones to legalize cannabis primarily because of criminal justice policies, right? They viewed the incarceration that occurred as a result of cannabis criminalization to be very, very problematic. And so we had states like California, like Washington, like Colorado lead the way. And so, we owe a great debt to many of these blue states that, paved the trail when it comes to cannabis legalization. But a decade into this movement, as more and more states have come online, cannabis has become more normalized to the extent that red states that previously would not have opted to legalize cannabis are now doing so. And the interesting thing is, as your question kind of alludes to, is that as these red states have started to come online, they've had a lower regulatory appetite than many of these blue states. And I think you're really right to hit on a state like Missouri, which was one of the first red states of any decent size to legalize cannabis. And, Missouri adopted a much more business-friendly posture towards cannabis, with lower taxes, for example. And so I think, again, your question hits on a really interesting phenomenon where the states that led the way on cannabis legalization tend to have more challenged legal cannabis markets because of their regulatory appetite. And these red states that initially were not super comfortable with cannabis, by virtue of the cultural change that's going on in this country, are more comfortable with it. And they are illustrating a different model about how cannabis can be regulated. And I suppose I'll conclude by saying, again, I think you bringing up Missouri is a really good example. The way I think about this is, Missouri, in my mind, was sort of the beginnings of a red wave in cannabis. So in November 2022, Missouri, voted to legalize cannabis and was the biggest red state thus far to legalize cannabis. It's been an incredibly successful market, one of the most successful markets in the country by virtue of having a lower regulatory appetite. And the way that I think about this is, Missouri was kind of the initial inklings that we had a red wave, that, cannabis legalization was not confined merely to states on the West Coast and the Northeast. I see the recent vote in Ohio, and I'm sure we'll get into it, as a validation of that red wave, as a further illustration of the fact that cannabis has bipartisan support. And I think the way that program is shaping up is, again, sort of illustrating this red state model for cannabis. And, Mike, I see Florida as the moment where, just symbolically, so to speak, where that wave crashes on shore. If we have a successful initiative in Florida, that will be a thunderous event that announces to the entire country that the red wave is here. And so I would say we are living in the beginnings or in the medium stages of a red wave that Missouri showed us, that Ohio validated, and Florida will be the moment where all of us in this country wake up and say, this is a solidly bipartisan issue.
Right. It's almost like a physical manifestation of what we know as a percentile bipartisan buy-in, right? Like when it's actually when it's brought to life, when it's actually going to be constructed and then created and then perpetuated by a state and by virtue of its constituency and its political leanings. Now it's just a question of not when, but how soon will these markets come to the starting line with the rest? By virtue of that, I'm actually kind of curious about your take on Ohio specifically. So in the way that we just talked about that duopoly and that dichotomy between, laissez-faire, free market, Republican, libertarian, however you want to put that, however you want to couch that dynamic, as well as bureaucratic, with tremendous amounts of regulatory oversight in, liberal Democratic enclaves. Ohio, how do you think it's going to perform? I mean, we know that it starts imminently within the next week plus, right? It starts early June. What is your take on the opening for the Ohio marketplace? How's the regulatory climate? The sales projections have been pretty healthy. And there's also the residual impact of surrounding states, which there are many, very consequential. How do you think Ohio is going to play? What's your read on how it's going to be built and how it's going to be executed on?
I mean, I think Ohio will be one of our most successful adult use states. I think it will have a very business friendly climate, which we can kind of get into. And I think Ohio, it'll take a few months for it to ramp up, but I think it'll quickly take the spot of being the sort of third biggest market in the country behind California and behind Michigan. And it may later be eclipsed by Florida, but I guess in short, I think it will very quickly be a top three, top four market. And so to dig into the details, first, you're right that Ohio will start imminently. So we're here talking in late May. We can expect adult use sales to start within the next few weeks. If you had to put a gun to my head and say, hey, when will adult use sales start in Ohio? I think sometime around the first week of June, by which I mean, the week of June 4th. And so we're very close to adult use sales starting. And so why do we think Ohio will be such a successful market? There are several reasons. First, it just has a very business-friendly architecture, right? So taxes in Ohio will be quite low. They'll be around 15%, which is on the low side compared to states like California and New York that can have taxes approaching 30 to 40%. It will actually have slightly lower taxes than its neighbor Michigan to the north, which has been the beneficiary of a lot of people driving up from Ohio. So that's the very simple and intuitive reason why the market will do well. Low taxes, we all know, lower taxes, better market performance. So that's number one. Number two, I would just say these regulations have been designed in a way that is just very business friendly. So Ohio will allow drive-throughs from the outset, which is something that many blue states, such as California, still view as too risky to adopt, right? And this, by the way, is quite similar to a place like Missouri, which from the outset said that things like drive-throughs are okay. Ohio will allow self-serve kiosks, right? So it'll be less of this highly regulated model where you have to talk to someone, right? You can go ahead and place an order without encountering that friction point, which I think is big. Ohio will have its dispensaries be open until 11 p.m. And I know that sounds like a small thing, but in many states in this country, dispensaries can only be open until 10, or sometimes when restricted by local law, 8 or 9 p.m. That just forecloses the number of customers that can go there. And so those are just some of the examples of sort of a business-friendly climate. And I would zoom out by saying that, the head regulator in Ohio, a gentleman by the name of James Canepa, I think there is good reason to pay attention to him and to be optimistic about the future of the Ohio program because of who he is. This is someone that has been a lifelong regulator in Ohio. This is not someone who's a political appointee and is the crony of a governor. This is a lifetime bureaucrat in Ohio. And most notably, what Mr. Canepa did is that he was previously in charge of the liquor authority in Ohio. And he was put in charge of that authority when it was in shambles, when it was not generating revenue, when it was not designed in a business-friendly way. And over the course of a few years, he really dramatically cleaned up that agency and dramatically improved the business performance of that sector in Ohio. So that's just a way of saying this is someone that has a lot of credibility with a lot of the major stakeholders in Ohio and has a demonstrated track record of leading Ohio regulatory agencies in a successful manner. And that's important. We have a huge divergence in the type of people who sit in these seats in different states. And he strikes me as someone who is very serious. And, perhaps a few more things that I'll say about why, I think Ohio will be so successful. We all know that it's a big state. It's a state of 12 million people. I mean, people forget because they tend to, only think about coastal states, but Ohio is the seventh biggest state in the country. So that's pretty remarkable. And sure, there have been other, big states that have come online in the US, such as California and New York. But as we all know, those states came online with very limited infrastructure. And so as we've seen in the case of New York, it has taken years, and in California, it has taken years for that infrastructure to ramp up. And so that's why, right, I think we can expect this state, it'll be one of the most exciting states to open up because we've never really had a state of this size with existing medical infrastructure in place to kind of turn on. And so I think it'll be more of a step stair function of growth, as opposed to linear. And, perhaps one or two other things I'll say, Mike, is there are 12 million people, but Ohio borders 4 prohibition states, right? So it borders Indiana and, it borders West Virginia, it borders Kentucky, it borders Pennsylvania. And not to make this into a geography lesson, but if you look at a map of Ohio and you look at the major urban centers that are on those borders, if you look at how many people live in the Cincinnati suburbs that actually live in Indiana or live in Northern Kentucky, if you look at how easy it is to drive from Charleston, West Virginia, into Ohio. If you look at how easy it is to drive from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania into Youngstown, we realize that not only are there 12 million people, but there are millions of other people that live just a couple of hours away. And what we have seen is that people are willing to drive extensive distances to access legal cannabis. We have seen in Missouri how states can be huge beneficiaries of that cross-border traffic. And so those are some of the reasons why I think the program will be successful. And to sort of round out, maybe this answer. Right now, Ohio does about $50 million a month in medical sales. So it's about $600 million a year. It's still a pretty limited medical market because of different product restrictions. And so that's where we're at right now, right? $50 million a month. And so I believe after adult use sales starts, it will very quickly ramp up to a number like $150 million a month, which would put it at about $1.8 billion run rate. Go ahead.
Between medical and recreational.
Yes, that's I think once adult use sales start, for all the reasons I mentioned, many more customers, cross-border traffic, I think it'll ramp, from around 50 to about $150 million a month. And the last thing I'll say is that I think over time that number will grow. If I were to say one negative thing about Ohio, or one reason, for us to be cautious, it's that, the state recently announced that it would speed up the date of adult use sales. That caught some companies off guard. We all know that cannabis is an agricultural product. You can't just create cannabis out of thin air. So it may be several months before a lot of these production facilities are fully ramped, right? We may be experiencing in July and August, some instances where some stores run out of product or don't have the full gamut of products, or lines are very long. So yes, there may be a couple of months where production is being ramped up, and that may limit sales. But I think within a few months, right, we will see those issues start to get ironed out, and sales will increase. And so I'll kind of conclude by saying, I think by, say, the end of this year or early next year, we should be getting close to that number. That's around $200 million a month, which would put Ohio at about a $2.5 billion run rate. And finally, I think over time, Ohio has the potential to be a $3 billion market. And the reason I say that, Mike, is that, again, going back to the example of Missouri, right? Missouri is a state of 6 million people. It's very similar to Ohio, and it's running at a $1.5 billion run rate. Ohio is twice as big. It shares many of those same characteristics: low taxes, neighboring states, business-friendly climate. And so Missouri illustrates the potential that Ohio has. Again, just want to note that it may take, maybe a year or so for the Ohio medical infrastructure to be fully ramped up to reach that $3 billion run rate. So that's how I see things progressing, right? You get to, the high ones, maybe $1.8 billion run rate later this year, right, by the end of the summer. And then you slowly inch up as production increases and as more stores open across the state.
Supply chain bottlenecks are always the first instance that has to be ironed out, right? You're going to have disequilibrium until you start having enough production capacity. You also need enough. You can have manufacturing licenses. That doesn't mean you have good third-party manufacturers to actually carry the torch with SOPs and actual products that can be put on shelves. So there's always a delay. I think the size and the scope of the delay remains to be seen, but it's going to be significant. Just to your point, population size, urban density. The tremendous amount of through traffic, and it has a logistics hub. Keep in mind, it also has a pre-existing infrastructure of well-known CPG companies. P&G actually has one of their headquarters out of Cincinnati, as an example. That whole, I think it's the southeast of Ohio. It's a huge, huge business quarter. There are tremendous amounts of parallel industry, as well as actually farming. Ohio actually has a lot of pre-existing farming infrastructure. Kind of akin to the Garden State, to New Jersey. I'm also kind of curious, while we're talking about this, the thought kind of went to JD Vance, a lot kind of similar to Josh Hawley in Missouri. I'm kind of curious about the fact that we have other legislation moving its way through Congress, specifically SAFER. Do you think that this red wave is going to be able to actually, in the near term, swing the votes necessary to actually carry legislation with it? Or is that something that needs to occur after this wave has crashed over a place like Florida, say? Do you think it could be possible for this to actually expedite that passage of legislation?
I absolutely do. And I think that's one of the reasons this is so exciting. We can get excited about the market itself and the way it might add to the TAM of US cannabis, right? As I mentioned before, $3 billion market. We have a $30 billion industry today in the country. So yeah, we could get excited about the fact that we'll, have a 10% increase on total sales. Sure, that's very exciting. But as your question kind of alludes to, I think there are other implications of this from a political perspective and how this might impact DC that are really exciting. And I think you're right to hit on JD Vance, right? So to unpack that a little bit, we just talked about how successful that we believe the Ohio market can be. And I think that has the potential to influence home state senators in particular. So you mentioned Josh Hawley. Josh Hawley, before Missouri legalized cannabis, was very vocally anti-cannabis. This is someone who likes to play in the culture wars and sort of adheres to that kind of line that some Republican politicians continue to adhere to, that cannabis is bad. What is notable is that his home state voted to legalize cannabis, and now it's a huge economic driver in the state. As I mentioned before, it's created tens of thousands of jobs. It's a $1.5 billion market. And so, look, I'm not going to pretend that Josh Hawley is now a huge fan of cannabis and is, sort of smoking J's in his free time, but he's been noticeably silent on the subject. After his state has come online. And so I think that's a good illustration of how the economic impact, if a program is rolled out in a way that generates a substantial economic impact in terms of employment, in terms of revenue, right, in terms of tax revenue, then it can change the strategy of a lot of these senators. And so, similarly, I think that JD Vance is actually quite similar to Josh Hawley, right? These are two of the next generation of culture warriors in the United States Senate. And as recently as a month ago, JD Vance was asked by some cannabis advocates what he thought about safe banking. And his pretty incoherent response was, well, I'm against safe banking because that will lead to more fentanyl trafficking. Like, you can Google this and kind of look this up. That was the answer that he gave, which obviously doesn't make much sense. My prediction is that 6 months from now or a year from now, he will no longer be able to make that claim because there will be huge economic interests that are succeeding in his home state. And so I think that analogy is a good one. And this just goes back to why this is all downstream of having a successful program, right? Earlier in this conversation, we were talking about all the reasons Ohio will be successful, just like Missouri, maybe Missouri on a 2x scale. That will impact how JD Vance thinks about things, and will impact safe banking. And, maybe one more thing I'll say on safe banking, the other point that's worth bringing up is that Sherrod Brown, the head of the Senate Banking Committee, who is a Democrat, is from Ohio as well, right? And so although he is more pro-cannabis than JD Vance is, once these businesses are up and running in a state and they continue to be hamstrung by a lack of banking access, there'll be more pressure on him, given his committee assignment, to make things move. And so that's how I think this will affect things in DC. And, maybe a couple other small points I'll bring up, and then happy to dive deeper into them, is I think Ohio will have implications for its neighboring states in a very robust way, right? So I think Ohio has the potential to change the conversation in Kentucky and in Indiana and in Pennsylvania. And if you'd like, I can kind of go into specifics about why I think it'll really move the needle there. In it when it comes to its neighbors. And then I also think Ohio will have huge implications for the vote in Florida in November, given the similarities between the two. So those are the political reverberations there.
Well, that's the interesting thing, which is we know that it's the ultimate case of domestic reshoring, right? You're talking about hyper-localized jobs with a hyper-localized workforce that really hasn't had much of an opportunity to support anything to this magnitude. And I think, to your point, the stigma and the not saber rattling, that's war. But to your point, I think what happens is people start to get acclimated to the fact that this is built by and is perpetuated by people of a state. It's not some, kind of, how would I put this? There's often kind of an image of who works in cannabis because there's always been an image of who uses cannabis. And that fourth wall sometimes sticks with people. And for whatever reason, it's representative of their thinking when it comes to the fact that, anyone that would want this job would be someone that probably smokes weed, and then they have all these misconceptions. Versus what it actually is, which is creating manufacturing jobs close to home where you can have access to and also have a career trajectory that wasn't there prior, right? Because we're compelled to and committed to having businesses that have to be situated and domiciled in these states in order for them to exist in the first place. Right.
Yeah,
so you can't just send it someplace else.
totally.
And I think that I think that's the fourth wall that happens, which is you have someone at church, at a place of worship, right? You have someone at parent-teacher conference that works in cannabis. It becomes synonymous with everyday existence, right? It's no different. They don't change. They're the exact same people. They just happen to work in a space perpetuating something that had a lot of prohibitive and public service announcements working against it. Now that it's normalized, I think it'll be easier to get people acclimated to all the benefits versus people hanging on to and for some reason internalizing the public service announcements that demonize it for so long. So I think the buy-in that happens first from a zeitgeist and a communal effort transmutes and speaks to the political strata very quickly and abruptly and adeptly. And I think what we'll start seeing, to your point, is legislative efforts from states and, more importantly, either public figures or public officials either not being vocally opposed anymore or in some way being able to reconcile past instances of them demonizing the very thing itself. So it's not going to be a complete flip-flop. I think people will be very casual in accepting it because it's the will of the voter. But I think some states will be faster to get ahead of the dial. I think some politicians will be very quick to adjust and reorient themselves around the fact that this is their constituency.
Totally.
Whether they want that to be or not, they are subject to change, whether you're whether your philosophical or your moral compass is dated.
Totally. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think the point that you're making about culture is a really important one. And I think, again, it's a point that's particularly relevant in the context of Ohio. I think a lot of people who maybe have only spent time on the coasts can't really get that, wrap their arms around what is true in the heartland, right? Which is that a lot of these states, they're culturally quite similar to their neighbors, especially the part of their neighbors that they border, right? And so if I think about Ohio again, right? If I think about northeastern Ohio, right? Or just the eastern part of Ohio, that is Appalachia, right? That is culturally indistinguishable from a place like West Virginia, right? If I think about like Youngstown, Ohio, that's the Rust Belt. That's culturally indistinguishable from a place like Pittsburgh. If you think about Cincinnati, right? Again, that is actually pretty much a part of Northern Kentucky. And so I think the point that you're making about culture is a good one. And I think those state lines are going to be very porous. And so it will sufficiently destigmatize cannabis where you're like, well, if people in Cincinnati have, the right to consume cannabis, then there's no reason why I living in the Lexington or Louisville suburbs, there's no reason why that's so alien. And I would also say that this is happening, a couple more things I'll say. This is happening on the backs of organic movement that's happening in those states, right? So for example, Kentucky just passed a medical cannabis program. It has a governor, Andy Beshear, who is very vocally pro-cannabis, right? And so they have been able to overcome the historic inertia of being a bourbon state to legalize medical cannabis. Ohio will just put fuel on that fire. Similarly, if I think about Indiana, Indiana is a total prohibition state, but once Ohio comes online, then literally every person in Indiana will be within a 2-hour drive of a dispensary, either in Ohio or in Illinois or in Michigan, right? Literally every person in the state, right? Just because of the way the states are set up, will be within a 2-hour drive. And so I think, that's another example. Finally, I think Pennsylvania is another great example where a legalization conversation has been going on for years because Pennsylvania kind of reflects American politics, which is to say, there are deep divisions in Pennsylvania politics between these big urban centers and this rural space. What is famously said about Pennsylvania is that it's Pittsburgh in the west, Philadelphia in the east, and Alabama in between, right? Because Pennsylvania has those same political divisions, this hasn't really moved forward, right? Despite popular support. Ohio has the potential to change that. So yeah, I just want to reaffirm the point that you were making about culture here, right? And the cultural similarities that exist across state lines and how this will normalize cannabis. And then finally, I think from a law enforcement perspective, if you pay attention to the commentary of cops, right, when a neighboring state legalizes, right, if you, have nothing better to do with your time and you're like me and you read what West Virginia police departments are saying about Ohio's legalization, you will find some flavor of, yeah, it's still illegal here. Yeah, I guess we'll still prosecute people who are found with weed illegally, but it's not our top priority, right? That is sort of the makings of a sort of deprioritization of this from a criminal justice perspective. And again, I think you can see examples of this in places like Missouri, where people harp on the absurdity of the fact that in Kansas City, Missouri, it is totally legal to buy cannabis, but if you walk 10 yards across the state line or in Kansas City, Kansas, it's a felony, right? That sort of contradiction reveals itself as ludicrous. So yes, I think, what we've touched on here is not just that Ohio will be an exciting market, but also how it'll impact the calculus, as you were mentioning, of people in DC, but it'll also dramatically impact the culture of citizens of neighboring states, of law enforcement institutions, of politicians who view the tax revenue they're losing. And so that's why I think Ohio is really the key to unlocking this red part of the Midwest. We have had success in the blue states in the Midwest, right? The Illinois, the Michigans. Ohio is the core red state to really unlock the Midwest and make it the cannabis power center that it has the potential to be.
I'm kind of curious, actually, now that you're talking about it. We're talking about Ohio and its ramifications. We haven't really touched upon Florida, a little bit. Have you watched the Amendment 3 videos by any chance?
I have, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I know that there's a 60% threshold in order for it to pass. I know based off our conversations years prior, there had been ballot initiatives that have had high turnout. There's some skepticism that this will pass the 60% threshold necessary. I don't hold that skepticism. I think it's going to pass. I think adult use. I think the headwinds, or excuse me, I think the wins at our backs as it pertains to that marketplace are pretty significant. I know that we both know that the how should we put it? The money going towards this initiative has been considerable already. I think they've had quoted about 55 some odd million by the end of March. So by this point, it's probably eclipsed over 100 million for this initiative. I don't know. I assume it's going to be pretty high. What is your take? Do you think it's going to pass? I think you're going to say yes. And if it does, what are the real ramifications? Because Florida up to this point has been an MSO enclave. It's been hyper monopolistic. You have to be true vert in order to be in the state. There's so few players in one mastodon that actually has a lot of clout in and out of the state. What do you think is going to be the ramifications if it does go to adult use?
Yeah, I mean, this is the big question, right? Will Florida hit the 60% threshold necessary for the adult use measure to pass? And so I'm going to put a stake in the ground and say, yes, I think it's going to clear 60%. And if I were a betting man, I'm going to say it'll get 66% of the vote. So that's my prediction. And we're here talking in May. I guess we'll circle back in 6 months in November and see whether that's accurate. So that's the stake in the ground that I'm going to put, is it'll pass, and it'll pass by a healthy margin. Again, I'll say 66%. And so let's talk about this, right? I think this will be a big topic of conversation in cannabis over the next 6 months. And so I think we can start with the arguments that people might make about why they're concerned about Florida hitting 60%. And there's some reasonable arguments here, right? People will point out, for example, that no red state has ever hit a 60% threshold in a ballot measure. And people will properly point out that a lot of blue states haven't hit that measure either, right? They'll point to California passing by 57%, just as one example. And so with narrow exceptions, places like New Jersey, places like Maryland, there aren't many states that have exceeded that 60% threshold. I think that's totally fair. Another thing that people might point out is that, the Republican Party of Florida, and this is a red state, has stated their opposition to this measure, right? And so people are concerned about someone like Ron DeSantis campaigning against this measure. So I do want to say, I think people are being reasonable in saying that, hey, we have some concern about whether this will hit 60%. But I will lay out for you why I think it will more than clear 60%. And again, as I said, hit 66%. There are many reasons for this. First, Florida, when it voted on its medical cannabis ballot initiative back in 2016, that passed with 71% of the vote. And so that was the highest margin of victory of any ballot initiative that the state of Florida has seen over the previous 150 years, going back to the Civil War. So I think it's worth noting that cannabis in Florida, medical cannabis, passed by a 71% margin, which again indicates its extreme popularity. So that's number one. The second thing that's relevant is this will be a presidential election year. And the electorate that we see during presidential election years is often very different than the one that we see during off-cycle elections. And, over the past, decade and a half, there have been some ballot measures that have failed on adult use cannabis, but almost all of these have come in off-cycle elections. North Dakota and South Dakota in 2022, or Oklahoma in off-cycle election. When there has been a measure on the ballot in 2012 or 2016 or 2020, and in my opinion in 2024, they have, with very narrow exceptions, tended to pass. And that's because the fact of American politics is you have a radically different electorate, a much more progressive electorate that comes out during presidential election cycles. So again, that's the second reason I think it'll be successful, is this is a presidential year. And to really, sort of dig into the details there, Mike, in 2014, Florida also had a medical ballot measure, but it failed. It only got 57% of the vote. It didn't meet that 60% threshold. So really think about that. In 2014, they got 57% of the vote. In 2016, basically the same electorate, a very similar medical cannabis ballot initiative, they got 71, right? And it's not like public opinion shifted that dramatically, a 14-point swing over the course of those 2 years. It's just you had a different electorate that was voting then. Similarly, South Dakota, when it passed in 2020, it passed with 54% of the vote, but then it was invalidated on a technicality. A couple years later, they ran another adult use measure, and it only got 47% of the vote. Again, that's a 7-point swing. So I think the important thing to note is that we have, the wind at our backs when we're running in a presidential election year. So that's the second reason I think it has the prospect for success. I'll lay out a few more because I think, it's really important to dig into the details here. The third is that, Florida has 900,000 medical cannabis patients, right? So it has a huge number of patients there. It's one of the most robust programs in the country. And typically in a presidential election, you have about 12 million people in Florida who vote. That's the number of people that will vote there. So really think about that. Out of the 12 million people that will vote, almost 1 million of them will be medical cannabis patients. And we can't predict how those people are going to vote, but my bet is that the vast majority of them see cannabis as benign and they want to see it normalized. So I don't think we've ever really seen something like that where so many of those medical patients will be voting. So that's another reason that I think it'll be successful. A few more that I'll mention. Cannabis will be on the ballot, but abortion will also be on the ballot in Florida in November 2024. And just to tie this to our previous conversation about Ohio and why I think Ohio will have such significant implications for Florida, Ohio kind of shocked the world in November, where a big red state, that is conservative on a lot of cultural issues, including abortion and including cannabis, announced to the world that they saw these as freedom issues, right? Both cannabis and abortion passed, with a 57-43 margin. And the parallels between what happened in Ohio in November 2023 and what will happen in Florida in November 2024 are uncanny, right? Two big red states with a conservative state legislature that have restricted these freedoms around abortion, right, and around cannabis, right, will now be putting this issue to voters. And so my prediction, Mike, is, shortly after this podcast airs, like when we get into July and August and September, when we are starting to see those headlines about Ohio's massive success, that will trickle into the media coverage of Florida, right? As people are voting in Florida and are discussing abortion and cannabis in Florida, the press will point to the analog of Ohio and how Ohio demonstrated that even a conservative electorate viewed these as freedom issues. And so I think that will take a lot of the wind out of the sails of a lot of these Republican politicians that will say that the sky will fall if you legalize cannabis, because we have an empirical example of a deep red state that has implemented an economically successful program. So I think that's why I think this conversation is so interesting, tying Ohio and Florida together, because it shows the way in which, in my opinion, the debate in Florida, when people are starting to vote early in Florida in September and October, this Ohio experience will be part of the discussion. So I think abortion being on the ballot and also the clear prior analog of Florida of Ohio will be important. And maybe two more reasons I'll mention, because again, I think it's really important for us to think about these details. The other thing is the Biden campaign has signaled that they intend to compete in Florida. Now, look, Florida's a deep red state. It'll be very hard for Biden to win Florida. Barack Obama won Florida twice, but, Joe Biden is not Barack Obama. So I'm not trying to suggest that Biden has a chance really of winning Florida. He probably won't. But because abortion and cannabis are on the ballot, he has signaled an intention. His campaign manager has signaled an intention to compete in Florida, in part because he wants to make Trump spend some money there, right? So Trump has less money to spend in places like Michigan and Wisconsin. But if the Democratic turnout operation is mobilized in Florida, then it brings out a slice of the electorate to vote that overwhelmingly favors these issues, right? If 200,000 more people, like overwhelmingly, right, in communities of color in Florida, go out to the polls, right, because they've been activated by the Democratic turnout operation, that will be huge for the votes there in Florida. So I think that really matters as well. And yeah, I think those are sort of the main reasons, right? Just so to summarize, you have a robust medical cannabis program, a ton of medical cannabis patients, you have a presidential election, you have the Biden campaign playing there, you have abortion all on the ballot. I think all of these things make the initiative more likely to succeed. And perhaps the final thing I'll note is that, the Smart and Safe campaign has now raised north of $50 million. And it'll be very difficult for me to see the opponents of cannabis generating that kind of fundraising on this issue so that they can compete with what will be a very sophisticated Smart and Safe campaign.
So final number is 66%. You think it's going to eclipse? Okay.
Yes. So I think it'll hit 66%. And I will also say, if we, you mentioned some people are concerned about Florida passing. I will tell you, I think the thing to be more concerned about, again, for the reasons I just mentioned, and look, I think it's important to leave it all on the field, take nothing for granted, run every election like you're 10 points behind. I'm not saying we should take this for granted, but for the reasons I mentioned, I think there's a lot of reasons to be bullish. I will say the one thing we have to be mindful of is what the state legislature in Florida might do. The Florida state legislature has a track record of invalidating different state ballot initiatives that they disagree with. And so that's why I think the margin of victory is so crucial. If you can run up a really robust margin in Florida of 66, 67, 68%, that will send a signal to the Florida GOP that they better not mess with this ballot measure that just passed. It'll also send a signal to the rest of the country. And again, I think there are clear examples in the past of the Florida legislature seeing an initiative that was passed. I think the best example is in 2018. The state of Florida passed a voting rights law that would make it easier for ex-felons to vote. What the Florida legislature said, okay, yeah, we get it. We think that these overwhelmingly, minority communities should have their voting rights reinstated. But hey, by the way, we're going to pass a law that says you can only start voting once you've paid off all your fines and fees. And if you don't have enough money to pay off those fees, then you can't vote, right? So there are creative ways that folks might try to gut the measure. And so I think if there's any takeaway here is that the margin of victory is crucial for putting the Florida Republican Party on notice that they better not mess with this initiative. And that, I think, should be our driving force behind trying to get as successful an outcome as we can in that state.
Right. It's not enough just to win. We have to win and leave little doubt. Right. That margin is specifically in order to kind of stifle the potential for the state legislature to put a lid back on it.
Exactly. And I think if we really win, right, if we have everything going for us, we run an amazing campaign, and if we take advantage of all of the trend lines that I was talking about before that I think are in our favor, again, my prediction is 66%, but just imagine a world in which we have a blowout victory, in which you hit 70% in Florida. That sends a signal to everyone in this country, right? That cannabis is here to stay. And, let's remember, right, politicians in Florida that are successful, right, their senators, or even someone like DeSantis, they've gotten 60% of the vote. Or like Rick Scott, the senator from Florida, won his seat by 50.05% of the vote. If cannabis wins at 70, it'll be much more difficult for those politicians to push back on it, because there'll be an empirical demonstration of how much more popular cannabis is than them, right? So yeah, I just want to emphasize this again. I think one of the best catalysts for the cannabis sector would be not only if this Florida ballot measure succeeds, but if it succeeds by overwhelming margins, because I think that's the thunderous event that lets everybody in this country know where a deep red state is on this issue. And then again, like we were talking about before, that bubbles up and that impacts national policy, right? If Florida is the place where, and I'm not endorsing this politics, but, if they say Florida is the place where woke goes to die, well, if they pass cannabis by 70% margin, they can't relegate cannabis to a fringe issue anymore. It'll fall squarely within the American mainstream.
Speaking, the other question I actually had was, we primarily talked about Ohio and Florida because the ramifications are so significant and so severe. And, we're going to find firsthand in terms of Ohio, because that's about to start, and then we'll find about Florida imminently when it comes to the election cycle come November. What about the other initiatives in 2024 for the last few minutes? I mean, I know South Dakota, North Dakota, Arkansas, Nebraska are up.
Yes.
I don't know much other than that. The only thing I do recall, though, is in the same way that you think that there might be a healthy turnout for Amendment 3 in Florida for adult use, Arkansas, being among the four that I just mentioned, was missed by a dramatic amount in terms of margin. It was much less than people were expecting for the adult use initiative in 22. So what do you think about those four other initiatives and marketplaces going into the rest of the year?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And so, the first thing to note is that these are all red states, obviously South Dakota, North Dakota, Arkansas, and Nebraska. And so it kind of fits with our theme. Obviously, Ohio and Florida are huge states that are, arguably more impactful, but, it fits with our theme that there's sort of a red wave that's emerging here. So that's why these states are interesting. And again, I will say that even though these are smaller states, and then we can go through each of them in a second, even though these are smaller states, every state matters. And what I mean by that is, right now we have 24 states that have legalized adult use cannabis. When 18 months ago, we were at like 16 or 17 states, the narrative was different. Now, when you read about cannabis in the mainstream media, they say half the states have legalized cannabis because we're at 24. Once that number, if we can get that, if a year from now, Mike, you and I are talking, and that number isn't 24, it's 28, right, or 29, right? That's a world in which the narrative is different, where they say, a clear majority, most of the states have legalized cannabis. It illustrates visibly the nonsensical nature of federal prohibition, right? There's just an intuitive way of being like, wait, that doesn't make sense. In most of the states of this country, cannabis is legal, but it's federally illegal. That just doesn't pass the smell test. So, these are significant not only because they're red states, as we've discussed before, but also because every state matters, even if it's a state like North Dakota or South Dakota that doesn't have too many folks in it. Now, with respect to these initiatives, right? You pointed out how Arkansas failed its adult use measure before. And again, I think that's a great point, right? A lot of these states, in fact, South Dakota, North Dakota, Arkansas, they have had adult use measures before, but those adult use measures failed when they were in off-cycle elections. Again,
Right.
with one exception being South Dakota that actually passed one during 2020, but it got invalidated on a pretty absurd technicality. And so it's important that these are up in November of 2024, because I got to tell you, otherwise we might be waiting another 4 years to get a successful outcome here. So that's why we should be excited here and care about these, potentially being on the ballot. And so to go through each of these individually, and they're all at different stages of development, and they're all slightly different ballot initiatives, but let's go through each of these individually. So there's South Dakota. This is the one that I would say is furthest along, right? So in South Dakota, they've already submitted their signatures. They have more than enough signatures for an adult use ballot measure. So although we're still waiting technically on certification, right? It's very likely that South Dakota will be on the ballot. As I mentioned before, when this was on the ballot in 2020, it passed with 54% of the vote, which is a pretty healthy 8-point margin. I think it'll do even better in 2024, or at least as well, because cannabis is more normalized. So sure, South Dakota is a small state, but you could easily see a world in which, Florida might be number 25, and on that same day, South Dakota might be number 26. So that's exciting. The other thing I'll say, and again, this goes back to our political conversation, South Dakota is also home to John Thune, who is the #2 Senate Republican. And when Mitch McConnell retires, it's very likely, it's not guaranteed, but it's very likely that he could be the Senate Majority Leader. And so, if you look at the Senate map, in 2024, the Democrats will probably lose the Senate. John Thune is probably one of the most likely people who in January of 2025, no matter who the president is, right, is going to be the Senate Majority Leader. I think we want him to be from a state that has legalized adult use cannabis because, again, just like J.D. Vance, just like Josh Hawley, thus far he's not down. We need to change his mind. And the way we change his mind, right, is through the will of his citizens. So that's why South Dakota is potentially exciting, even though it's a small state. North Dakota is a little bit earlier in the process, so they're still collecting signatures. The signature deadline is July. Again, people on that campaign have expressed optimism that they'll be able to get enough signatures. We won't know for another couple of months, but I really, really hope we're able to get more signatures, because if we don't do this in 2024 in North Dakota, we're going to have to deal with it in 2028, right? And so it'll remain prohibition for a while. So that's why I think these states are so important, right? We have a narrow window here. This isn't like a New Jersey or a Maryland where, okay, we'll just put it on next cycle. We need a presidential year. And so that's why those two states, despite being small, I think are important, and we should be watching closely. So those are the two other potential adult use measures, along with Florida, that we know is already on the ballot. And then, you mentioned Arkansas and Nebraska. These are a little different. These are medical measures, but I think they're fascinating, again, in their own right. So Arkansas, you were kind of alluding to the politics earlier. In 2022, Arkansas had an adult use measure that got creamed, right? And so I think anyone listening to this, should be kind of skeptical. They're like, wait a minute, the Arkansas adult use measure failed by more than 10 points last time, right? And so yes, right, like we saw in Arkansas how the Republican Party can really mobilize against an initiative. What I would say is a couple of things. One, that was in 2022, an off-cycle election. In 2024, as we do in presidential cycles, we're likely to see a different electorate. And secondly, and this is the thing that I think is really fascinating, right? Arkansas actually already has a medical program. Their ballot initiative is going to be an expansion of that restricted medical program. So in Arkansas, we're seeing, a calculus that, hey, maybe in some red states, still whether we can get someone to, support an adult use measure is still kind of questionable. So let's run this initiative that is about expanding the medical program. And what is so fascinating, in my opinion, what is so genius about this initiative is that it trades on conservative principles and ideas, right? It says, for example, right now in the Arkansas medical program, there's a very narrow list of medical conditions. Only a specific type of doctor can give you the prescription that you need to use cannabis. But what the Arkansas measure would say is, in keeping with conservative thinking, like, hey, who is the government to tell you, to get in between you and your doctor, right? I mean, that's actually a very classic conservative argument on healthcare. It's like, dude, we don't want the government, socialized medicine stepping in between you and your doctor. And so by eliminating that list of qualifying conditions, by saying you can go to any medical professional, even a physician's assistant, it doesn't have to be this type of doctor who can write you a prescription. Like, that's a pretty conservative idea, right? And so that's really persuasive. It would also do all these other things like, allow for telehealth, expand, you only have to get your card renewed every several years instead of every year. It would dramatically reduce the fees. And so it sort of presents a model of how we can move from these restrictive medical programs, which are a common feature of red states, like, okay, we'll allow medical because we have to, but we're going to do it in a really restrictive way. But now that comfort has built in Arkansas, they will adopt a position that reflects the idea that cannabis is actually medicine, right? And so it really kind of beautifully dovetails with what's going on at the federal level, right? Where the HHS is telling us that cannabis is medicine, and now Arkansas is trying to codify a real medical program. And so that's why I think that is so exciting and presents a model for what a robust medical program can look like in places like the Deep South. And so again, we're still waiting on this to be certified in Arkansas, but I'm optimistic that it'll do so. And I think again, it provides a good example of what a robust medical program can look like. And then finally, Nebraska, again, right? I get it. There may be some people saying, like, who cares about Nebraska? How many people even live in Nebraska? But the reason why this is important is right now there are 38 states that allow for medical cannabis. If you get that number up to 39 or 40 or 41, right? It's much more difficult for Kevin Sabet and a lot of these prohibitionists to say that cannabis isn't medicine, right? It really illustrates the ludicrousness of that position. It's hard to say with a straight face. 42 states have legalized medical cannabis, but cannabis isn't medicine, right? That just makes a mockery of our republic. And so again, we're still waiting on these signatures to be submitted in Nebraska, and it'll be another couple of months there before we know for sure. But I think we have reasons to be cautiously optimistic about the signature collection effort there, and that'll be another state that I believe if it gets on the ballot, it'll pass. As I've said before, I think when you put something on the ballot in a presidential election year, it is almost certain to pass. That's where this country is on cannabis right now. And the other sort of quasi-fascinating thing about Nebraska is that Nebraska is one of two states in this country that splits its electoral votes by congressional district. And so normally in most other states, right, you win California, hey, you get all 53 of the electoral votes. You win Texas, you get all 30 something, right? It's a winner take all type deal. But there are two states, with Maine and Nebraska being the two, that actually apportion it by congressional district. So it's possible for you to get some, but not all of these votes. And so there's one congressional district in Nebraska, the one that surrounds Omaha, right, the sort of urban part of the state. And I know we're getting into the weeds here, but I think it's interesting. There's one congressional district, right, that has a couple of times in history, like during the Obama 08 campaign, that the Democrat has won. Normally, the Republican wins all the districts, but this sort of purplish district in Nebraska, there are two times, I think, in the past century that a Democratic candidate has won that district surrounding Omaha. And so this could be a really, really, really close election. Just imagine a world, right, in which this medical cannabis ballot measure, especially in a liberal part of the state, draws additional turnout from people who are honestly not used to voting for president because their vote hasn't mattered in the past, right? Imagine a world in which that affects the outcome. I know that sounds like a stretch, but I just would like to remind everyone that, you know, in Arizona in 2020, Joe Biden won by 10,000 votes in Arizona. And, you know, again, just to stick on the examples here, before Biden won Arizona in 2020, only one Democrat since Harry Truman had won Arizona. I mean, think about that. For a 60-year stretch, right, between when Harry Truman was president and when Joe Biden won in 2020, there had only been one instance, and that was Clinton in 96, where a Democrat won Arizona. But in 2020, Biden did it on the backs of the on the backs of the adult use initiative that drew turnout to the polls, and he won it barely. So there is precedent in this country for cannabis in purplish and red states drawing people to the polls and enabling a different outcome that we haven't seen in decades. So will that happen? I don't know, but Nebraska is still exciting for those reasons that I just mentioned.
Hirsh, thank you for the education. Whoever is watching this and, you know, disseminating all of the information you've given us, which has been rich and compelling and accurate, in my opinion. I mean, I don't know if there's anything else to add. If any burning desires before we say goodbye.
I think the last thing I'll say, and this is sort of, I think, the capstone to this entire conversation is, you know, I think we all want to see progress on cannabis in this country, particularly at the federal level. Many of us who have been working in this space for years have been frustrated at the lack of federal progress. The way that we get federal progress in this very divided country is by enlisting more members of red states into our growing cannabis coalition. The analogy I would use is that, you know, once red and purple states started legalizing gay marriage, then Barack Obama finally had to come out after he was reticent before and express his support for gay marriage, and then the Supreme Court followed suit, right? Like once Iowa, legalized gay marriage, then Barack Obama had to be like, well, okay, maybe this isn't just a Massachusetts, California thing, right? So similarly, once Ohio and Florida and other big red states come online, then that will change the calculus of a lot of politicians in DC and of the Supreme Court as well, right? They reflect the organic movements that are happening in this country. So I think everything that happens at the federal level is downstream of the grassroots work that we are doing at the state level, particularly in red states. And so I think that should be the focus of the cannabis industry over the next year or two, so we can get to that promised land that we all want to get to.
Hirsh, what's the best way for someone watching this, listening to this, reading this to contact you?
You know, I'm on a bunch of different social platforms. If anyone is on Twitter, or, you know, also known as X, you can find my handle Ananda Strategy. That's ANANDA Strategy. You know, I tend to post a lot on there about my cannabis policy thoughts. You can also go to my website, which is anandastrategy.com. Again, that's ANANDA strategy.com. And that'll have my contact information. But in case you need it, you can also email me, which is just hirsh@anandastrategy.com. So that's HIRSH at ANANDA strategy.com.
Thanks again for the time. That was a very healthy, very robust, extremely informative geek out session. Thank you for watching, everybody. Questions, concerns, insights, Hirsh has given us information. Thanks for tuning in. Take care. See you out in the field.